Socket types are one of the aspects of the new 2012 objectives, or the 800 series of the A+ exams, that's getting a little different attention this go around. And so I want to make sure that I point these out to you. This is going to be a two-part video because there's a fair amount of information that I want to make sure I cover with you here and make sure that I lay a good foundation. And then we'll go a little deeper in this in some separate videos. But on this iteration of the A+ exams, they're going to go just a little bit deeper with you here about socket types, because keep in mind on A+, they consider the CPU to be a replaceable part, a field replaceable unit, an FRU, meaning that in their mind you would go out to a user's machine, see that they're having a problem with the CPU, and replace the CPU. Now in real life, for most of us, it's more cost effective to replace the entire machine. But this is CompTIA's exam, and you need to see it their way to pass their exam, okay? That does happen in some cases. I'm not trying to be negative about the exam or anything, but just understand that they always consider that a replaceable unit. So now, what is a socket? Well, a socket is really a mounting device for the CPU. Keep in mind, the CPU does all the processing, right? It's the brains. Well, it has to connect to the motherboard so everybody can communicate with it and it can communicate with them. Well, that becomes a problem, okay? Because let's talk about a little history here. The very first early PCs had the CPU actually attached to the motherboard. The CPU itself was soldered to the motherboard. It was there. If you had any problems with the CPU, you had to get out your soldering gun, take that thing off, put a new one on. Wasn't fun, wasn't cost effective. Most people didn't do it. They just simply replaced the motherboard. Then that was not a good idea, and so the advent of the socket made CPUs replaceable. And especially back when our machines were going from 12 to 16 megahertz to 24 megahertz to 50 megahertz to 100 to 150 and so forth. They were changing quite a bit, and so a lot of manufactured models of PCs got the idea of, hey, wait a minute, let's just put a socket out there, and by lifting the CPU out and dropping another one in, they can upgrade this machine. And so the CPU became replaceable. So now the socket is actually attached to the motherboard, and the CPU just kind of sits on top of it or fits down into the socket. Now there are two main socket types that you need to be aware of for the exam. Everything else I gave you was filler to get you ready to come right here, okay? So the two main socket types are, first, the ZIF socket. And this is what it looks like, and it means zero insertion force. Notice these processors and this one right here, and notice how many pins are going to go down into this socket. So if I drop the processor on this thing, notice that it's got this corner notched out, so I know how to turn the processor. Well, the processor has to sit down against this pretty tightly to make sure that all those pins make contact. But man, I don't want to take an expensive processor, put it on here and start putting pressure with my hands and foul this thing up, bend one or two of the pins, and now I just destroyed a perfectly good processor and an expensive one. So notice, I don't know if you can see in this photo, there's a little handle here. That when I get ready to put a processor on here, I'll lift this handle up, very, very gently set my processor in place, and then push the handle back down. It will lock that into place, and I don't have to worry about pushing on it or pressing on it. Notice zero insertion force. I don't have to push anything down to make it pop into place or lock into place, okay? The next one is LGA. Now LGA means Land Grid Array. Now this is kind of interesting. All they've done is switch it. I don't know if you can tell from this photo or not, but instead of having the pins on the CPU sticking down, going down into the socket, an LGA socket has pins sticking up. And so the CPU doesn't have any pins. It just has little holes that these pins go into, and the CPU just kind of sits on top, makes contact with those pins, and everybody's happy. Now notice this one, you'll hear them called flip-top LGAs or whatever. You can put the processor in here, lock it in place, and then shut this, and it makes everybody line up. There's all kind of ways to do this, okay? Make sure you understand the difference between a ZIF and an LGA. A ZIF has, again, holes. Let me back up here. And an LGA, or a Land Grid Array, has the pins on the socket and the CPU has the holes, and it just kind of sits on top of that. Okay, as long as you know that, you're in position now to get past a lot of the CPU type questions on the exam. Join me in part 2 and we'll talk a little bit more about the socket types.